Hey there, hello, my name's Lines, great to see you. Now, today we're going to be going through how to draw the crotch and butt. But before I get started, I just want to say thank you for the 100k. While I'm sure there's milestones yet to come, I just want to take a moment to say thank you for the huge amount of support and confidence. It's given me even more drive to invest in making the most useful videos and materials I can, but enough of that. Now, one other bit of news on the in-person classes. If you're interested in participating, stick around towards the end of the video for a bit more info. Now, this is going to be video 6 of 7 of my in-depth body tutorial series. This one is going to be on the pelvis, the butt, and the crotch. We're going to be covering things like a simplified way of putting the pelvis together, what that simplification is representative of. We're going to do demonstrations at front, back, bottom. We're going to do things like 3/4 angles for male and female. We'll talk about things like how to get the volumes of the butt, how to do the surface planes, how to connect the rib cage, how to connect the thighs at different angles, and how to do things like changing the leg position to then change the butt shape. There's a lot to go over, so let's get into it. Now, if you do like to follow along and draw along with the video, that's great. So what I've done is I've made these pause points, so listen out for this sound. When you hear that, I'll have notes on screen so you can pause the video. You'll have all the visuals and text you need to follow along up to that step. And if you want homework to do, I'm also going to make this homework sheet available. That'll be linked in the description. So have a go at that. There's a good way to get a bit of practice in, and you can pop into our Discord there and share it. Also, take part in the art community. We've got a bunch of different things going on. We even have server events. In fact, the Speedpaint from this video is part of that, where you get to dress one character as another character, and whoever wins gets to help me pick what I do for the next Speedpaint. Now, if you like what you see, hit like, subscribe, leave a comment. A lot of the videos I've made have come from ideas that you guys have given me in comments or in the Discord, so I'd love to hear what you guys have to say and what you guys would like to see. Now, if you're in a position to do so, you can also join the Patreon. I've even got a few Patreon rewards where I put the PSD files from the videos, as well as special one-to-one speed draw-alongs on Patreon. Now, with all that out of the way, let's begin. So the first thing I want to cover and make clear is that every pose you see in this video is yoga. Okay, you're listening to YouTube? It's yoga. So, this, in fact, is the yoga instructor. Her name is Sandy. She is a yoga instructor. This is all yoga poses. She's very nice. It's yoga. It's Iyengar yoga, I think it's called. Or maybe it's like energetic yoga. I'm not sure, but all of these are yoga. This is the yoga instructor. That proves it. Rightio. Moving right along. So then we're going to construct the block for the pelvis. This is going to be a block that's sort of like the shape of an eraser if you sort of rounded the edges off. As far as the dimensions go, it'll tend to be wide, that'll be its longest dimension, and then the second longest dimension will be its height, and then its depth. Now, these sizes are based off the torso. So if you're not familiar with how to put together a torso, I've got a whole torso video up, and I've also got the base body construction videos in this series. So if you want a refresher, go for that. But otherwise, you're looking at a ratio of about 1 deep, 2 tall, 3 wide, but none of those are set in stone. You can make whatever kind of dimensions you want. Remember, they'll vary a lot. People have different sized parts of bodies, different heights, different widths, different depths. It's up to you, but what's important is you be consistent with it. So this is the shape I'm going to go for. So once I've got them, what I'm going to do is the bottom edge of the front surface, I'm going to divide that line into fifths. Now the only part of that I need is that middle fifth. That gap there is going to be the thigh gap on both a male and a female character. And then from that, I'm going to draw lines up into the corners, the top corners, of the front plane of the pelvis. And once I've done that, I'm going to do a second set of lines starting at those same points, and they're going to come up to halfway up the sides. This is going to be where the thigh crease is. Now once I've done that, we'll have a line down the back surface, and then halfway down the back surface, I'm going to put a little notch, and then from that notch, I'm going to draw lines up and out at 45 degrees, and reaching then that top edge of the back plane. That is going to show me that flat bony area for the tailbone. And then, after that, much like the front, I'm going to draw lines from the corners down to that center there. But since I don't have that thigh gap in the front, it's just going to come in and meet together in the middle. Now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to place the femurs. This is the bone that the thigh wraps around. Now these are shaped sort of like an L shape, but it's not a very long L. So they're going to come out from that surface that we've defined on the inside there. Those divisions between those top corners and the center, those are going to create two flat planes. And you can see here with the one on the right, where it sort of makes this V sort of wedge shape. And it's in the middle of that these bones are going to come out of. You don't have to be super accurate with this one. That's generally the direction of where it's going to come out from. Now the next thing you want to do is going to divide the front surface of the pelvis in half along the middle. This is going to help us get some of those contours in, things like the belly and the mons or the bulge for the male character. So we divide it into 4. Now interestingly, the middle dot on this line is going to be roughly where the navel would be. Sometimes it can be a little higher, but that's up to you. And then we're going to do a U shape down from the first and third of those notches. And it's going to come down to about halfway down the front surface of the pelvis. This is the end of the abdominal muscle band where it comes down and joins the pelvis. And then below that, on a female character, in that space, those middle fifths, I'm going to add the bulge for the mons. This is actually caused by the pubic bone that sits underneath it, and it'll come up to about a third the height of the front surface of the pelvis. And then on a male character, I'll do the same thing with that ending U shape of the abdominals, but then for the bulge, I'm going to make it come down a little bit. It's going to leave the pelvis. Now, it's up to you how big you want to make this. It's also up to the weather. If it's colder, draw it smaller. Next thing then is to draw the balls for the knees. Now you might be thinking, this is a crotch and butt video, what do I need knees for? So a lot of the shapes of the pelvis are changed by the positions of the thigh. And since you need the knees to connect some of the muscles to, then you're going to need those as part of the thighs to then build the crotch. And we'll talk about why in a bit, but you do need knees to construct the crotch. Then, on a male character, on the left here, what I'll do is I'll divide the length of the thighs in half. And on a female character, I'll divide the length of the thighs into thirds. This is just to get the overall shaping right. So once I've done that, I'll make some very, very simple, very angular shapes coming out from halfway down the pelvis, and then they'll come out to the notch on a male character and then go back in to the knee. And on a female character, they'll come out to the first notch, they'll skip the second notch and go straight to the knees. So on a female character, their thighs will widen for the first third and then narrow for the next 2/3 of their length. And on a male character, the thighs will widen for half and narrow for half. There'll be a different shape. Now, once that's done, we're going to start constructing the butt. Now on a male character, the butt will be a little bit of a different shape because there's no fat pad on the side of it. So what we'll do, in green, I'll mark out the top of the tailbone there on the male character. And then I'll mark out the bottom edge of the buttocks just below the edge of the pelvis. Your buttocks come lower on the back than the crotch sits on the front. So make sure that when you're adding the butt, it comes down lower at the back. And so then, I'll do a little notch leading into the crack, and then I'll do the butt cheek. And now since this character's butt is tilted a bit to the left, that means that I'm going to draw that butt line for the buttock on the right over the edge of the pelvis. Remember, that line on the pelvis is the bone underneath, which means if the buttocks have any volume and the waist is tilted, then the edge of that buttock is going to go over and cross that line. Now on the sides, I'm going to draw lines down. Now you can't see it from this angle, but on a male character, the outer edges of the butt are actually going to indent in a little bit. They're going to follow lines along the side of the pelvis. And so they're going to indent in. Now this is going to be different on a female character. Now, speaking of which, let's start the female character. So again, we'll do a line below the bottom edge of the pelvis, and then using that shape on the back of the pelvis there, that's not the tailbone area, we're going to find the buttocks. But you'll notice on a female rear end that we don't have an indentation in. It comes out. They have fat pads on the sides of the pelvis, which give it a different shape up around the waist. Now, one of the other things we're going to do, and we'll talk about this as well later, is that depending on the direction the legs are facing, whether they're leaning forwards or back, that'll change the shape of the buttocks. The buttocks are attached to them, and if the legs move, they'll compress that mass. And since that mass remains constant, it'll move, it'll get a crease, it'll lose a crease. It'll really change a fair bit. And we'll talk about that a lot later as well. And now we'll just add some rib cages on here to show the basic way of connecting them. So on a male character, we're going to connect down on the back. We'll have latissimus, which connects almost perfectly into that V shape at the top for the collarbone, tailbone, sorry. And then from the front, we'll have the obliques coming down, and them on a muscular male character can actually come out over the edges of the pelvis. And the pelvis on a male character can tend to be a bit taller and a bit narrower. Again, it's up to you to decide how much, but it's a general rule to make things look more or less male presenting. Now, on the female character, we're going to tend to have the rib cage be narrower than the bones of the pelvis. So in that case, we expect the lines from the rib cage to come out to then meet the pelvis. And then we're also going to have the abdominal band. So like we mentioned when we were drawing the front contours of the pelvis, there's that U-shaped band on the front of the pelvis. And that's held fairly rigidly. That's sitting on top of a big, massive bone, so it doesn't tend to move around very much. Now the abdominals above it will move quite a lot. They're all set to a real squishy area between the rib cage and the pelvis, so they're quite dynamic. Now to place them, we're going to draw a line across the center of the rib cage, and then just draw some lines down from those dots we've got on the front of the pelvis to get that contour and that band there. And so then, we'll go over this with some white chalk, and you can see a lot of these construction shapes aren't necessarily part of the outlines. A lot of them are just going to be there to inform where we do our shading or how we plan the shading. So whenever you're drawing these shapes, don't expect yourself to have to do all these construction shapes every time. Quite often you'll internalize these, you'll skip a few of them. It's up to you to decide which ones you're going to need. If you're doing no shading at all, you may not want to do those front surfaces of the pelvis. Or if you're doing them from the side with no shading, you may still need them for the contour. So it's really going to be up to you and what you need. And then we'll draw down the thighs. Now see these two little lines here? These are the sartorius. Now the sartorius is going to be a big part of how we shape the thighs. There's another muscle that also shapes the thighs. We'll talk about that soon. But keep in mind, that's going to pull in around the top bit of the inner part of the knee. And then drawing in the contours on the back of the female character, and then we'll throw in some sort of reverse shading highlighting here. And we've got these forms done from just those construction shapes. Now, moving on to the next thing. This I want to talk about very briefly, and we'll talk about it more in depth with applying it, but there's another bit of details on the bottom plane of the pelvis. So just like on the front plane we can map out those features, we also need to map out those features on the bottom plane. For this, once you've drawn that set of 5 spaces along the bottom edge of the front surface of the pelvis, between those 2 dots in the middle, you're going to draw a V shape that comes down either halfway or a little more than halfway down the center line of the bottom surface of the pelvis, like so. And then, when you add that mass for the mons, or the pubic bone where it bulges out, you're going to add some rounded mass there and bring it in. We'll talk a lot more about this and how it moves around, because it's actually quite a dynamic shape from low angle, but it's important to remember this when you're constructing the pelvis's base forms. And on it, we're going to have a couple of points we want to talk about. So when we're building things, this bottom surface of the pelvis, we're going to use this to construct the butt and a bunch of other stuff. For that, we need a couple of anchor points. So on that V shape there, those 2 points there, on that bottom edge of the front surface of the pelvis, I'm going to call them the top V points. Those are essentially the pubic bone, and where those bone anchors connect a bunch of stuff to, on both the pelvis and on the legs. And then the 2 dots below it, I'm going to call them mid-V. They're useful for a bunch of stuff, but they're more dynamic. So I want to make distinct those 2 connecting points. There are anchors for building out a bunch of other stuff. So, what are all these simplified shapes representative of? So we start then with these same simplified shapes of the pelvis. So we'll begin then with those rectangular prism shapes that are the longest is their width, the second longest is their height, and the third longest is their depth. We'll start out with splitting that surface into fifths along that front edge. We'll draw those lines up to the corners, and then we'll draw another couple of lines up for the thigh crease. And then we'll draw in those masses for the bottom bit of the abdominal band. as well as the mons. And you can see here, when we draw them from the side, we're going to add those as an increase in thickness to that front edge. So we'll keep that in mind. Now this is the shape we're using for construction. But why are we using it? What are these shapes representative and simplifications of? So, if we were to mark out the points on this that are essential, that will be where the bones of the pelvis come to the surface. So we'll start with things like the iliac crest. That's that big bony line that comes along the top edge of the sides of the hips. These are your hip bones. So if you bang on your hip, that's this. And then we'll also include things like the tailbone, so where the pelvis connects to the spine. It's a big flat bit that sits on the back. Well, it can feel flat. It's actually not very flat itself, but functionally, we're going to draw it as though it's flat. And then we have the pubic bone on the bottom at the front. And this is where a lot of the things will anchor to for the legs. And so, when we do those same shapes from all the different sides, like we have them from, front, side, etc., you can see that these are the features that we're going to be nailing everything to. These are the bits we need. These are the bits that come to the surface. But there's a lot more below the surface as well. So, let's now do a bit of exploration on what this is a simplification of. If we draw in the pelvis, you can see, we'll do that in purple, that there are a lot of relatively complicated shapes. The only part of it that we really need from the internal shapes is there's the socket joint for the femur, where it joins into the pelvis, and there's also, you can see, the sit bones on the bottom, where it bulges down, as well as on the back, there's a couple of edges of the iliac crest that come back out further. Now, these won't come to the surface, but when the leg is bent, they're going to influence the shape of the flesh around it, and that's going to be important for when we're shaping the butt at different kind of leg orientations and positions. And then if we go over the top of this with some simplified volumes, you can see how those volumes are informed by the bones underneath them. So getting to know this stuff can be useful. I don't recommend drawing it, basically ever, but it's still important to know that it's there and know how it works because it helps you build on those ideas. Now, let's draw a male and female pelvis just to really highlight some of the differences in construction. So just like before, start with your basic block. Mark out that middle fifth on the bottom front edge. Draw the lines up to the corners. You can pop in the knees. You can then do the notches on the top surface, that U shape for the bottom bit of the band of the abdominals, as well as the mons underneath it. Making sure that the band for the abdominals comes down halfway to the front surface, and the bulge for the mons only comes up about a third of the way. And then we'll have the lines from that bottom fifth division up to halfway up the sides for the thigh crease. And then we'll draw in the femurs that come out from those slices, and they come and join the balls of the knees. And I'll just quickly neaten this one up. And so we've got the base construction shapes here. Next thing you want to do is divide the length of the thigh into thirds, because this is going to be a female presenting character. And once we've got that, we'll have it widen for the first third and narrow for the remaining 2/3. Now, you can start this widening further down the sides of the hips if you want. That'll create hip dips. Or you can start it higher up. That's also fine if you like more of the curve. It's up to you. There's no hard rules here. There's just different ways of choosing what you want to do that will create a different impression. Now, when shaping the thighs, one of the first and most important ones is the sartorius. So the sartorius starts in that upper corner of the pelvis and runs all the way down to the inside edge of the knee. That's the band responsible for your ability to rotate your leg, to essentially spin your foot left and right. And what it does is it goes over the surface of all the other muscles, which means even though it's not a very big muscle, it really influences the shape of the thigh. And then we're going to mark it out, even though it won't be very apparent, the adductor longus. So this is the one that's going to connect from that top V, those notches there, on that bottom edge of the front surface, and it's going to go from there around to the outside edge of the knee. This one, however, doesn't wrap around the surface. It digs straight between all the other muscles. So where the sartorius in orange is going to wrap around like a coil, the adductor longus is not. It's going to just disappear in between the other muscles and grab the knee. But you are going to see it once the knees are spread out far away from each other. Once you bend your leg out, this muscle will really show up. but then it basically disappears once your knees are closer together. And so, if we go over this and just give some smooth line art over the outside of it, more sort of sketchy line art, we'll keep in mind there's that sartorius. So when we draw the line for the inside contour of the thigh, we'll have that bulge in just above the knee because the sartorius is pulling in, like the band on a sleeping bag. It's going to bunch it up and pull it in together. And so remembering then that when we draw these shapes, typically on most bodies, male or female, overall the limbs will taper from thick to thin over their length as they extend out from the torso. So same thing's true on the leg overall, but on each individual limb section, it's also true there, where it'll start thick and end up thinner. Things get narrower towards your extremities. Now, if we do a male pelvis, we'll start with a box, but we'll start with that box being a bit taller. And so then we'll do the shapes, same as before. We have the bottom edge divided into fifths, draw the lines up to the corners. We establish that bottom U shape for the abdominals. We then also add in that bottom edge there for what would be the bulge for the mons, but in this will be the bulge for just, well, it'll be the bulge. Now, what we'll also do is on the side of the male pelvis, we're also going to divide the side planes in half to use as guidelines. And then when we do the thighs, instead of having it divided into thirds, we can divide it in half. Now you can divide it in thirds if it's a really muscular character, but you'll actually have it with the widest point 2/3 down instead of 1/3 down on a really muscular character. This one I'm going with a fairly muscular character, so I'm just going to do it about halfway down. And then we'll add the bulge in, and so then we'll add the buttocks. So without that fat pad on the side of the hips, the thighs are going to make a contour up the center line of the side of the pelvis on a male character. That divot is there, those muscles are there on a female character, but they're hidden by the smoothness of the fat pad that sits on the side of the hips there. And so then, we'll go over those. Now from the back, a lot of the same things. So we'll do the pelvis box again, but we'll make it a bit taller to make it look more male. And again, we'll draw those lines for the femurs, and then we'll divide those shapes up for the thighs. But we'll also do some rings around the cylinders of the thighs to help establish where the thigh ends and the buttock begins. And so those rounded shapes are going to be based on the tilt of the legs. If the legs are tilted back, that'll change that cylindrical section of the thigh and how it meets and interacts with the pelvis. In this case, they're pretty even, so we don't have to add too much of a crease for the butt. And then we'll smooth those lines out. We can then, in green, add where the obliques will connect to the pelvis, and our male character, since the rib cage will be wider and the obliques can be bigger, the muscles will actually overhang the pelvis in some cases. They don't have to, but they can. And then, when we do a female pelvis and a male pelvis next to each other, you can see that we'll start with the blocks, with the male one being a lot taller. But we'll have the same construction shapes on the front edges, same thighs, but then as we begin to build out those features, those differences will help express the difference between the male and female pelvis and crotch and butt. So, same things before. We'll do the bottom edge, that U shape of the abdominals, they come down. And then we'll add the bulge for the mons, or on the male character, the bulge for, well, the bulge. And you can see that on the male character, that comes down and leaves the pelvis. It's external. Now on the female character, we do the rib cage in, with the rib cage tending to be narrower than the width of the pelvis. That means that the waist will come out. Whereas when we draw the rib cage on the male character, since the rib cage in a male character will tend to be larger than the width of the pelvis, that means that typically the lines will come inwards a bit. And you can have larger obliques coming over the edges because there isn't the fat pads on the side of the pelvis to smooth that shape out. And so then we'll have on the side of the male character that little divot in halfway down to show the edge of the muscle. This is the gluteus maximus, the big muscles on the butt. And then we'll draw the thighs, remembering on a female character that the thighs will be at their thickest point 2/3 of the way up, but on a male character the thighs will be at their thickest about halfway down. And you can see with just these simple shapes, if I go over that with a sort of sketchy line art, you can see one of these will present as being very female, whereas the other will present as being very male. And then throwing a bit of tone on there. Now if we follow this with a bit of contours and we wrap them in, you can get a really good idea on how much more rounded the sides of the female pelvis are, and then how much more angular the sides of the male pelvis is, especially where it can divot in on the sides of the pelvis where there's no fat pad on the side of the butt cheeks. Now, next thing would be where we start deforming some of these shapes. So nothing here is static. A lot of the things can be very static, like where the iliac crest is, but some stuff can move quite a lot. So for example, we'll have a female pelvis here, facing down, and we'll map out those front contours, those front surfaces, and then we'll do the femurs, but we'll have them, the legs, coming forwards. And what this means is that cylindrical shape of the legs is going to interact differently with the pelvis. So where we would have that second line coming from the sides of that bottom fifth and having them come up as straight lines to make the thigh creases, since the thighs are coming up, that's going to bend the thigh crease line up with it. And so as the shapes for those thighs come up as cylinders, you can see that line for the cylinder, as it comes up, is going to lift then that line for the thigh crease up, and it's going to bow upwards because the leg will change the shape of the features of the pelvis. Now, before we move on to adding the masses of the butt, I want to talk a little bit about what I call dome theory. So imagine then we have a couple of squares and each one of them has a dome on them. If we have them, you can see that those circles for the bases of the dome, they don't cross that center line at all. But as soon as we add that dome in for the one in the foreground, you can see that the height of the dome means it crosses over that center line. It no longer sits just on that one side. This is important to remember. You don't want to draw the center line around the back surface of the pelvis as being the same thing as the line of the buttock. So that's dome theory, to keep that in mind as we go. Let's begin and let's draw a butt. So we'll start with the pelvis. We'll do that center line down the middle. We'll do halfway down that line, mark a point out, and then draw some lines up and out at about 45 degrees. Now for this one, we're going to do the two legs going in different directions. Now the leg on the left is going to be bending back. The leg on the right is going to be moving forwards away from us, and that's going to change the shape of the buttock. So starting then with the femur, put them in, and we'll give ourselves little guidelines here to figure out where that's going to be. Now you can just see it on this one, but there's that top and mid V points. Those are anchors that we're going to use to shape that bottom edge of the buttock. This is essentially a loop that starts on the front, on the top V, and loops around the leg and comes back in and rejoins in the mid V. Now we'll get more into it there, but just remember that there's going to be a sort of circular edge here, sort of like the top of an impossibly high sock that comes right up and is literally the line of the butt cheek. Now, with that shape, remembering dome theory, and that this is a pelvis that is pointed off to the left, we'll start adding the masses for the buttocks. So, remembering that we leave no mass on that tailbone area, that top area, we're going to draw a line out and down and around, and it's going to come down and it's going to meet that looping line we've made. And depending on the direction we're facing that looping line, that line for the bottom edge of the butt is going to dip down or it's going to come up, depending. Now, since this leg on the right here is coming forwards, then that line would tilt down. But then also, since this thigh is coming forwards, that means it's going to stretch the mass of the buttock forwards. As your legs bend forwards, your buttocks have to wrap around the now longer surface. And that means the creases, like the butt crease, will disappear. However, with the leg on the left, when we draw that one, we're going to draw that leg coming back a bit. And since it's coming back, that's going to compress the buttock up, and it's going to make a crease. I think it's called the gluteal crease. But the gluteal crease disappears when the leg comes forward. You'll still have some continuation of the contour, and the crease doesn't just snap out of existence. It can be a little bit, it can be quite long, it can be quite short. You might still have it, but you might only show it with a bit of tone. It's really up to you, but you want to make sure that in a neutral position, you don't have overly described gluteal creases, because that'll look like butt bags, and that can look kind of bad. And then we'll have that V shape there for the bottom surface of the pelvis, and we'll use that then to define the crotch, if there's any gap between the thighs that you would see it through. And then we throw some tone around, and then we've got the shape of the butt. Now, next thing would be really getting into how much the shape of the buttocks will change based on the position of the leg. So, with the two pelvises here, I'm going to have the pelvis on the left with someone bending over forwards. So they're going to be leaning forward and their knees are forward. Okay, a lot of stretch here. So really going to be bending and stretching the flesh around the buttocks. But on the one on the right, I'm going to have them upright, and I'll even have their legs back a bit. And so that's going to cause all that flesh to compress together. So then, we'll mark out that bottom surface of the pelvis, which we are going to need to help shape those creases. So we have a line through the center of the bottom surface of the pelvis, and then about halfway or 2/3 from the front, we'll make a notch, and then we'll make 2 lines that come up and connect to that middle 1/5 of that bottom front edge of the pelvis. So this is that bottom V shape for the crotch. And so the one on the left, again, will be stretched out. The one on the right is going to be compressed. So we'll add in the femurs, so the bones for the thighs, and on the one on the left, they're going to be coming forwards to really increase that stretch. And the one on the right, they're going to be coming back to really increase that compression. And so here where we start going to draw these guidelines from that top and mid V that wrap around the leg. So the top V comes around the front. The bottom V comes around the back. Now, depending on the leg position, these can be a little bit tricky to track, but we'll start with them very easy. Now, when we've got the leg on the right there, you can see that the line from the mid V is going to loop around and come back. Imagine you hold a loop of string. You put your finger through it and you twist your finger around. That's going to cause the string to cross over in the middle as you wind it. The same sort of thing happens here. So that loop around the leg will go from one to the other, but as you move the leg, you twist that loop. It can be a bit tricky, but thankfully, at the more extreme positions, you don't really need it anymore because the leg is so stretching of the flesh that all the creases disappear that you would need to map out. And so, much more straightforward with the legs on the figure that is standing upright, those are just going to loop around. Now, remembering dome theory. So, we're going to add in then the mass of the buttocks, firstly, on the pelvis that is bending over. So what this means is it'll stretch out all this flesh. And so while we're not going to have a crease, the gluteal crease, we are going to have the mass dip in around. So even though it's not going to crease, it's still going to pull inwards towards there. It won't fold, it won't have an edge, but it will still have an inward contour where that crease would be. And then, on the figure that's upright, we'll have the buttocks coming in, but you can see that the buttocks are going to stick out a lot more from the edge of the pelvis. If you imagine you have the same mass, but you squish it in, then it's going to have to come up to a much higher point to maintain that same mass. The mass of the butt never disappears. It always is maintained, meaning if you compress it, it has to go somewhere. And so, if we draw the lines in on the butt on the right, where the legs are straight, you can see that it really creates a very strong contour and a fold there where the thigh meets the buttock because they're compressing in together. And so we'll go over this with a sort of chalky line, and you can see on the figure on the left, we still have that contour for where the buttock would be, but it's not a fold anymore. It gets stretched to the point that it's just a bit of a dip in the road, a bit of a U shape. But it's also not on the outer edge. If you're bending over forwards, then the outer edge is going to be very, very smooth. You shouldn't have a butt crease when you bend forwards on the outer edge. You can have it on the inner edge, around the crotch, but not on the outer edge. That means you have, terrible butt implants or something. And so you can see here, there's that bit where it's a crease when the leg is bent back, but it's a curve when the leg is bent forwards. You can also see that the mass of the buttocks is roughly the same, even though it gets compressed. The other thing you'll notice is here that there's more mass towards the center than there is towards the outer edges. We'll talk about that and how it works now. So, let's draw out 2 pelvises. We'll have one box of the pelvis that's pointing straight for us, and the other one that we're going to see just the back surface of. Because we want to talk about why the shape of the buttocks goes the way it does. Now you'll see that I'll do these 2 blue notches on that bottom back edge of the pelvis. This is a reminder for me for where the buttocks will be their tallest or thickest or come out the most. Now here is why. If we could see the full pelvis from the back view, we would see that these 2 notches correspond with where the sit bones are. That's the bottom part of the pelvis. And on the back surface, we'd see that those 2 bulges are lining up to where the iliac crest comes down. So you're not expected to draw these bones every time, but this is why these notches are here and why the buttocks will tend to be tallest at these points. There's bone under the surface that when you bend the leg, it squeezes it against the bone. And since the bone is rigid and the rest of the flesh is not, the bone will remain the tallest point, whereas everything else will squish away. So when we draw in the contours then, we can see on the butt that is pointing towards us that the buttock will come up towards where the sit bone is, and then it'll start to come out and down around the sides. But it won't come up with its highest point in the middle of the width of the thigh, it'll come up to its highest point towards the center. And so then we'll draw the rest of the thigh in, and we'll have that contour there. We'll also remember that the thighs will be wider over the first third and narrower for the next 2/3. We'll draw in the mass for the crotch, and I'll put little blue flags on top there for the highest points. So you can see they're much closer together. They're not in the middle of each section of the thigh. Now, on this one here, with the butt, with the legs moving up, you can see we do still have those 2 notches for the highest part of the butt, but you can see that it's not because of the iliac crest anymore, but now it's because of the sit bones. It has the same function of making it come out more towards the center than the individual center of each thigh, but more towards the center of the figure overall. So from below, or in this case from behind, you can see that those 2 points there are going to curve the butt cheek up towards the center because of the bits of the iliac crest that come down towards the tailbone. And then the sit bones will also cause the same thing to happen when you're viewing the back surface of the pelvis. And the sides here, when the legs are bent a lot, will tend to be the thickest point of the width of the thigh as well. And if we map those contours, we can also see what I talked about before, which is that on the inside of the thighs, the contours will curve in. So you won't get a fold of the gluteal crease, but you will still get that internal contour. And then if we map the same contours out for the butt on the right, we can see that it'll have its thickest point, or its longest point, towards those sit bones, and the rest of them will wrap around those contours. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is getting the spacing right between the ribcage and the pelvis. I've covered this in a previous video, so I'll only go over it very quickly, but it's worth repeating because it is a bit of a sticking point for a lot of people. So if we have now a figure here, and we'll do the 3 primary bone masses: the skull, the ribcage, and the pelvis. Now, if we bend them all back and bend them all forwards, one of the things you'll notice is the distance between the chin and the chest and the ribcage and the pelvis will really change a lot on the front, but it won't change in the back because the spine is how they're articulated. So since the spine is static in its length, it doesn't stretch or compress, it will always stay the same length. And since it's articulated along the back edge, moving forward and back will really change the distance along the front surfaces of these things, but on the back surface, they won't change at all. And so then, let's talk a little bit about how to twist them. If we imagine at its simplest, the ribcage and pelvis are 2 rigid blue boxes. And we had to connect these 2 rigid blue boxes with some red rubber bands corner to corner. You can see that as we turn one box against the other, that bends the bands around. Because there's the rigid area, the bone masses, the boxes in blue, and there's the soft, squishy red stuff in between. And so, if we were to use these as demonstration torsos, we could use these to map out things like where the abdominals are. And so you'll have the parts that squish, and the parts that don't. So, on a real figure, we would have the pelvis and ribcage there, and the spine that they're articulated by. And then, we would add things like on the front, we'd have the band of the abdominals that comes down from just below the pectorals, and on the back, we'll have the latissimus, which connects under the arms down to the tailbone. And so, when we want to twist the figure with these features on there, we have the 2 bone masses, which are the rigid components, and then we'll twist them, and we'll wrap those muscles around, and that'll cause the twisting and spiraling of those elements. Now, the next thing is to talk about the bottom surface of the pelvis. This is the crotch, and it can be quite challenging to do. So, like we demonstrated at the start, we'll have that same front surface, but then below it on the bottom surface, we'll use that division of fifths to make that V shape, where those 2 points of the front edge are going to come down to either halfway or a bit more than halfway along that center line. to give us our top V and our mid V. Now, when we're joining the leg, we want to have these as our anchor points on the pelvis. The top V and the mid V, they're bits of bone basically, which means that's where the leg is going to anchor the muscles to. That's where some of the bone of the pelvis comes to the surface and things connect to it. And then the other anchor point on the leg is going to be the side of the thigh there. That's where the muscle of the butt will come in and join the femur. That's a big solid point of stability. That's one of the anchors we can use. So we'll loop a line around, starting with the top V, looping around. It's going to contact that point on the side of the thigh, and then loop back around under and join mid V. And we're going to use that to make the division between things like the butt cheeks and the thigh. So then, as we draw it out, we'll draw those shapes there for the thigh that are going to come in and anchor at that top V and mid V. And then the space underneath that, that's where the buttocks are going to join. So in green, we'll add them. And remembering dome theory, even from the front, you can see that the bit of the buttock we can see on the leg on the right is going to come out over that middle line because it has thickness and volume. Then the next thing is we talk about the adductor longus. So this is a very situational muscle to see, but in the situations where it's visible, you really do notice it. So from top V, there is a muscle that goes from it directly to the outer edge of the knee. But you only really ever see it for that first third because after that, it disappears underneath a bunch of other muscles. So it's very, very situational, not just in when it shows up, but where it shows up. And so the more you stretch the legs out, the more you increase that distance between that top V edge and the outer corner of the knee, the more it will show up. It'll very seldom need like line art or have a fold over, but it will still really affect your contours and especially your shading. And these are going to be the big masses that are going to add depth and contour to the bottom surface of the pelvis. Now the other thing is that when you move the legs out like this, other things will happen to some of the shapes there. One of the first things is that you'll notice that that V shape there is going to get wider and wider the further apart the legs are. The sides of those two sides of the V shape are tethered to the legs. As the legs move out, they also move out to the sides as well. And that'll widen that presentation. So it can look quite narrow, that V shape, but it can also widen quite a bit if the legs move out far enough. And then we'll go over it with a bit of simplified line art and some tone. And then if we map it out with some contours, you can see we've got the bumps there, the middle band of the abdominals, coming down to the pelvis where it flattens a bit between the abdominals and the mons. And then we'll add the bulge for the mons. And we can then start adding the contours for the thighs. And so you see the first thing we do is we map a line around the thigh on the left, but we have it bump up for the adductor longus. And then as it comes down, it gets to that point where we have the thigh and the buttock meet, and it'll create a bit of a crease or an indentation there. I'll do that on the other side as well, and you can see how, when the legs are bent out, the adductor longus makes this kind of pointed ridge on the surface of the thighs, and you really see how these features of the inside of the thighs will change shape based on the position of the thighs. Now, how does this work on a male figure? Basically the same. So if we have a male pelvis here, we do legs, and then we do the same thing with that top V and mid V. And since the leg on the left is coming out, but the leg on the right is not, that V shape is going to tilt out more towards that leg that's coming out. And so then we'll do the shape for the thighs. Since it's male character, we'll have the thickest point about halfway down. And then, once we've anchored those to the top and mid V, we'll have the space where the buttocks will go. Now, since it's a male character though, we won't just add the bulge for the mons, of course, we're going to add the bulge for the bulge. So that'll sit below that front edge of the pelvis. And then we'll add things like the sartorius, where that wraps around the outer surface of the thigh, and that's going to affect the overall shape when we do some inking. And you can see we also have the adductor longus. So it's not really going to show up much on the leg on the right, but it's going to show up quite a lot on the leg on the left when we do the contours. But since we're just doing inking, we won't really be showing it. So it's only really needed there for things like shading and contours, but for the outer edges, it'll very seldom change the outer contour of the body. Now the next thing I'm going to do is show how the thighs and crotch will change as the legs move up quite a lot from the front. So we'll have the legs here in a fairly neutral position. We'll do the shape for the pelvis. We'll do the marked out points for the top and mid V. We'll use those to loop around the thighs to mark out where the buttocks will be. We'll then connect the thighs to that top and mid V. And then we can use that space below to show where the buttocks would be visible, and add a bit of thickness then to the mons. And with that, we're done. But what to do when the legs come right up? So, remembering that we need to have the contour of the outer edge of the thigh and butt come out more towards the center, so we'll mark out those two notches on the bottom edge of the back of the pelvis for where the sit bones will be. And then we'll have the knees up high and we'll connect the femurs to them, the thigh bones. And so then we connect the shapes up like that, imagining that they're cylinders that get shorter. Now, the shapes you use for those loops around from the top and mid V can be tricky to describe here. If we were to do them and mark them out, we'd see that since the legs are inverted and that loop is going to be flipped over. You can see it there where it loops over. Like remembering if we have a loop of string and we put our finger through it and then twist our finger around, that'll make the string cross over. Same thing's happening here. However, tricky though that might be, it's not actually a problem. Because once you bend the leg up that much, what's going to happen is you won't have any thigh creases to really worry about. You'll have to remember things like the inside edges of that V shape for the bottom surface of the pelvis, that they'll tilt out from the mid-V points, but there really isn't any crease there to worry about. So even though it can be tricky to flip that over, that loop around that starts from the top V, loops around and back to the mid-V, you don't really have to worry about it. Once it becomes too tricky to do, it becomes too stretched for it to even matter. Now, here we'll have a character with a leg tilted straight up. So, same thing, we'll map out those front and bottom surfaces of the pelvis, and then we'll tilt one of the femurs straight up and one straight down. And we'll map out then the top and mid-V. And we can see then that on the leg that's bending straight up, we've got to remember where those sit bones will make the buttock come down. And then that loop around doesn't really matter because everything's stretched so much, we don't need to know where the butt crease would be. We just smooth it out. However, on the leg that is coming down, we need to know a couple of things. Number one, we do need that loop to find out where the difference is between the buttock and the thigh, and also we need to know where the adductor longus is going to be, because since the knees are bent out away from each other, the adductor longus is going to show up and interfere with the contour. It's also going to happen on the leg that's pointing up, but less so for two reasons. It's not quite as far out, and all the mass of the thigh is kind of covering it up from the front. If we imagine we have like a basic thigh here with one leg coming down, and as we move it out, you can see how much longer the adductor longus has to be. So that's the muscle responsible for contracting to pull your knees together. That's what it does. Now with all that, let's do an image to put it all together. So this is my little bit of fan art of, I think it's Rebecca from Cyberpunk and Morrigan from Darkstalkers. And it's going to be very pelvis-centric. So I'm going to start with my bone masses, and I'm going to have the pelvis here. I was going to have an image for the Speedpaint that was going to be very sort of crotch or butt focused, but I figured YouTube would like that, and the last video got dropped off a cliff, so I thought I'd give this one a bit of a break. And so we'll have the hands leaning on the pelvis. I've got the thighs connecting into the pelvis as well, remembering that they're wider for the first third and narrower for the next 2/3. And then I'll tuck the knees under, and then I'll do the rest of the body here. I'll have it leaning forward with a sort of naughty expression. I'll have the two sort of ponytail things, and that little bit of hair coming out the back there. I'll try to combine the sort of head wings thing with the hair ornaments that the character from Cyberpunk has got. I'll add the wings in, and I'll have a few goes at it because the wings are a bit tricky. And then I'll add in some of the facial details. So I've got my first pass of my sketch, and you'll notice I'm staying zoomed out for the whole thing. And I won't zoom in until I've got the basic proportions. You don't want to get in and start doing detailing before you got your foundational stuff right. And then once I've got the sketch okay, I'll make it a bit transparent, and I'll go over it with the ink. So just some naive ink. And then the second pass here, you can see where the regular ink's gone blue. This is me adding a little bit of thickness to all the little darkest bits, and that's going to be for my ambient occlusion. That's what I like to thicken my line art based on, little bits of ambient occlusion where it would be darkest. And then I'll go over and do the basic flat colors, and then I'll turn my sketch back on for a sec so I can remember where things like the neck tattoo is, and things like where the patterning on the legs are. And then with that, I can start on my shading. So I'll just throw a little quick gradient on there because I want to have this character in the sort of night sky of Night City. And so I've got that sky background there to sort of see how that tone's going to work. And you can see that the shading on here, especially on the skin, is coming out much, much, much too dark. And that's okay. I'm doing it all on one layer with a sort of grayish purple. And then I'm going to go back in and tune those colors in with a very neat trick later on. And once I've done that, I'll go over and do the highlights on things like the leotard and the tights. And then the background, it's going to be a very, very simple thing to do. I'm just going to get my gradient. I'm going to make a couple of squares with the marquee tool. I'm going to clone those squares out, fill them in. There we are, buildings. And then it's time to make some lights. So I'm going to draw some lines, and I'm going to cut some holes in those lines. And those are now windows. And then I'll just make them glow. I'll add a bit of the glow for the city as well. And then with that, I've got my background. All I need to do now is just blur it a little bit so it separates it from the character. Throw some stars up there as well. And then go over and do one last pass on the character. Now the reason I'm doing this one last pass of highlights on the character after I've done the background is this is one to connect the character to the background. So it's going to be a lot of blue underlighting on the character so I can make sure it sort of connects with the background. And now, once I've done that, I'll make a selection of the character, just to basically make a stencil of them. I'll make a new layer, make it blue, and then blur it, and that'll give me an outer glow effect. Clip Studio doesn't have the outer glow effect that Photoshop has, but also it's not Photoshop, so that's a definite point in its favor. And then, once I've done that, I'll clone everything to a new layer. You can see in the Layers tab there. I'll start using that for a bunch of effects. So the picture's basically done. Now I'm just getting in and doing a bit of the polish. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to clone it, and then I'm going to blur it and make it slightly transparent. And what that's going to do is give it a bit of a soft focus. I'll grab another one, I'll blur that, and this one, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go Edit and go Levels Adjustment, and I'm going to really sort of deep fry it like that. And so I'm going to make a blurrier, deep fried version of one of those layers. What this does is it gives me something I can put as an overlay layer over the top, and that's a much better way of applying increased contrast. Increased contrast normally does it on a per pixel basis, whereas this is more regional since it's based on the image itself. Then the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get a gradient map and just go for a sort of cooler set of colors, like a sort of purple or sort of cyan. And then once I've put that on there, I'll set that blend mode to color or hue and just really lower the lower the opacity down a bit so that it barely shows through. I just wanted to overall sort of cool the colors. Now, with that, we're done. So we've gone over the pelvis, how to put it together, how the parts are constructed. I've shown you a demonstration of how good understanding of the pelvis, butt, and crotch can really help an illustration along. Now, if you like what you saw and you've been following along and you'd like to do a bit more, there's the homework sheet that you can do. That's linked in the description. You can also take that homework sheet, pop in the Discord, share it there. You can, like, subscribe, leave a comment. Now, if you're in the position to do so, you can join the Patreon. I really appreciate the support that I've gotten there. It's great. I've got the PSD files up available there. There's a bunch of extra exclusive speed paints that I do that should hopefully pick up back at the end now that once the year has started up. And now, for those of you interested in the classes, so I do in-person live classes. If you want to find out about them, pop into the Discord. There's an announcement you'll see fairly recently. The first intake is going to be starting in the mid to early point of February, and there'll be a second intake starting in the latter part of February through to early or maybe mid-March, depending. So if you're interested, pop into the Discord, have a look at the announcements, and you can follow up on the details there, and there's all the stuff about pricing, what's happening, when, etc., etc. In the meantime, thank you very much for your time. I hope you look forward to the next one. It's going to be on legs and how to shape them. So I'm excited. I hope you're excited too. Cheers. Have a good one. Bye.